Eliza Hartwell knelt in the dirt beside a dying cow the whole town had already given up on, her hands trembling as she pressed her palm against its heaving side. Behind her, the men who buried her husband 3 months ago were laughing. They called the animal cursed. They called her a fool. What none of them understood was that this broken, starving creature would become the reason Eliza Hartwell stopped burying herself alongside her grief. If this story moves you, subscribe. Now, stay until the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction yard smelled of manure and cheap tobacco, and Eliza Hartwell stood at the edge of the crowd, with her hands folded tight against her apron, trying not to let anyone see them shake. "Sold for slaughter," the auctioneer barked, slamming his gavel down on a crate. "Next lot. This here bony heifer barren as a stone ain't worth the rope to lead her." A ripple of laughter moved through the men gathered near the pen. Eliza didn't laugh. She looked at the cow standing alone in the corner of the enclosure ribs, pressing hard against dull, patchy hide, one ear torn ragged from some old fight eyes, half closed, like she'd already decided the world had nothing left to offer her. "Do I hear $2?" the auctioneer called. "Come on, gentlemen, she'll make decent enough glue." Nobody raised a hand. $1 then. Somebody take this sorry animal off my hands before I have to shoot her myself. "I'll take her." The words left Eliza's mouth before she'd fully decided to say them. Every head turned. She felt the heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her chin level the way her mother had taught her to do when the whole world seemed to be waiting for you to break. Silas Boone, the largest cattle and dairy man in 3 counties, stepped out from beneath the shade of the loading platform, thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, boots polished despite the dust. He looked at her the way a man looks at a coin he's already decided isn't worth picking up. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Didn't figure you had $1 to spare, what with your husband barely cold in the ground, and that mortgage note coming due. My money's my own business, Mr. Boone." "Your business is my business when you're 3 months behind on water rights through my land." He smiled slow and easy, like a man who already knew how the story ended. "But go on, buy your dying cow. Might do you some good to have something else to bury." A few men chuckled. Eliza felt her jaw tighten, but she didn't answer him. She'd learned in the last 3 months that answering men like Silas Boone only fed them. She walked to the pen, dug the last dollar from the bottom of her apron pocket, the one she'd been saving for flour, and pressed it into the auctioneer's palm. "She's yours," he said, already losing interest, waving toward the next lot. "Good luck getting her home. She won't walk for nobody. Kicked 2 of my hands already." Eliza opened the gate slow the way she used to open the door to the barn when her husband Thomas was still alive, and the horses would nicker soft in the dark expecting oats. The cow didn't move, didn't even lift her head. "Come on now," Eliza said quietly. "I know you're tired. I am too." The cow's ear twitched. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Lord knows there's been enough hurt for the both of us this year." Slow, so slow, it made the men behind her mutter and shift with impatience. The cow lifted her head, looked at Eliza with dark, wet eyes, and took 1 step forward. Then another. "Well, I'll be—" someone muttered. Eliza didn't look back. She led the cow out of the pen with a length of frayed rope past Silas Boone, past the laughing men, past the auctioneer, already forgetting her name, and started the long walk back to a homestead that was falling apart, plank by plank. The walk took the better part of 2 hours. The cow moving slow and stiff, stopping twice to catch her breath like an old woman climbing stairs. Eliza didn't rush her. She'd learned patience the hard way sitting beside Thomas's bed those last weeks, watching fever take a strong man down to nothing. "You got a name?" Eliza asked the cow more to hear a voice than because she expected an answer. "No, I don't suppose they'd have bothered naming something they meant to shoot." The cow snorted low and rough. "Fine then. I'll call you Patience. Lord knows you've got more of it than half this county." When she reached the fence line of her own land, she found her neighbor, Mabel Cross, waiting by the gate, arms crossed, face already arranged into the expression of a woman who'd been rehearsing her disapproval the whole walk over. Eliza Hartwell, tell me you did not spend your last dollar on that animal. Afternoon to you too, Mabel. Don't you afternoon me. That cow's half dead. Everybody in this county's seen her. Silas Boone tried 3 times to breed her, and she never took. Barren, sick, mean as a rattler when she's cornered. You're a widow with no husband, no sons, and a mortgage note due in 6 weeks, and you spent your last dollar on a dying cow instead of flour. I know what I spent it on, Mabel. Do you? Because from where I'm standing it looks like grief's finally cracked you clean through. Eliza felt the words land somewhere tender, but she didn't let it show on her face. Maybe it has. But I looked at that cow standing in that pen, and I thought there's a creature that everybody decided wasn't worth the trouble of keeping alive. And I know exactly what that feels like right now. Mabel's face softened just slightly before she caught herself. That's not the same thing, Eliza, and you know it. Maybe not, but I've got a barn standing empty since Thomas passed, and I've got nothing left to lose by trying. Mabel sighed long and heavy, the kind of sigh that carried years of watching people make choices she couldn't stop. You're going to starve out here, Eliza, alone with a sick cow and a leaking roof. Sell the land to Boone. Take the money. Move into town, live with your sister. This is my land. Thomas and I built this place with our own hands. Thomas is gone. The words hit harder than Mabel probably intended, and for a moment, Eliza just stood there, hands still wrapped around the rope, the cow's warm breath against her palm, the only thing keeping her upright. I know he's gone, Eliza said finally, voice steady, even though her chest wasn't. I bury him a little more, every single day, Mabel. But I am not going to bury myself right alongside him, not yet. Mabel didn't have an answer for that. She just shook her head, muttered something about stubborn women and empty stomachs, and walked back toward her own place, leaving Eliza alone with a half-starved cow and a barn that hadn't held an animal in 3 months. The barn smelled of dust and old hay, but it was dry, and Eliza spent the better part of an hour clearing out a stall, laying down what fresh straw she could spare. The cow watched her work with tired, wary eyes flinching whenever Eliza moved too fast. Somebody hurt you bad, didn't they? Eliza murmured more statement than question. I can see it in the way you watch my hands. She fetched water first, set the bucket down, slow, backed away, to give the animal room. Patience approached it careful, sniffed twice, then drank like she hadn't had a clean drink in weeks. There you go. Nobody's gonna hurt you here. By the time the sun dipped low enough to paint long shadows across the yard, Eliza had found a bit of grain in the bottom of a nearly empty sack, mixed it soft with water, since the cow's teeth looked worn and uneven, and watched her eat with something that felt for the first time in months like purpose instead of grief. That was when she heard the horse. A rider came up the lane, slow, unhurried, the kind of pace that told Eliza he wasn't a man in any particular rush to prove himself. She stepped out of the barn rope still loose in her hand and found herself looking up at a stranger she didn't recognize. Tall, broad through the shoulders, a few days' stubble on his jaw, a battered hat pulled low against the last of the sun. "Evening, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't mean to come up on you unannounced." "You're on my land, mister. Announcing yourself now would be a start." A faint smile crossed his face there and gone. "Fair enough. Name's Colt Bishop. Was passing through, heard some commotion at the auction yard about a woman buying a dying cow off Silas Boone's lot. Figured I'd see for myself if the stories were exaggerated. And now that you've seen..." He looked past her toward the barn, toward the cow standing in the doorway, watching him with the same wary eyes she'd given Eliza that morning. "Stories weren't exaggerated. That animal's in bad shape." "I'm aware, Mr. Bishop. I don't need a stranger riding up to tell me what I already know." "Didn't mean it as an insult, ma'am. Meant it as an offer." He swung down off his horse, slow and deliberate, giving her plenty of time to object if she wanted to. She didn't, though she kept her grip tight on the rope, just in case. "I've spent some years working cattle. Worked a stretch as an army farrier before that, tended more sick and broke-down animals than I care to count. If you'll let me, I'd like to take a look at her." "Why would you want to do that?" "You don't know me, don't know her, Ain't nothing in it for you." Colt Bishop looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes made Eliza feel like he was measuring more than just the cow. "Maybe I've got my own reasons for not much liking to watch folks get kicked when they're already down." Eliza didn't answer right away. She thought of Thomas, of how trusting a stranger's kindness had never once gone well for her family, not since the bank man who'd smiled so wide while explaining the terms of their loan, not since the doctor who'd promised Thomas would pull through. But she thought too of the cow standing behind her, breathing slow and ragged, and how pride had never once put grain in an empty trough. "Fine," she said finally. "But you so much as raise your voice at her, you can get back on that horse and ride on." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." He approached the cow, slow hands loose at his sides, murmuring low words Eliza couldn't quite make out. The cow flinched back to step, but didn't bolt. Colt crouched, ran his hand gentle along her foreleg, checked her teeth despite her half-hearted protest, pressed 2 fingers against her ribs, and listened close to her breathing. "Well?" Eliza asked when he finally straightened. "She's malnourished bad. Teeth are worn near flat, which means she's had trouble grazing proper for a long while, maybe years. That's likely why Boone's men called her barren. A cow can't carry a calf to term if she's starving. It ain't that she's broken. It's that nobody bothered to actually look at her." Something tightened in Eliza's chest, a feeling she didn't have a name for yet. "You're saying she could still—" "I'm saying with proper feed, clean water, and some patience, this cow's got a real fighting chance at coming back healthy. Might even breed again given time. But it'll take work. Real work every single day for weeks. I've got nothing but time and work, Mr. Bishop. Time's about the only thing this town hasn't managed to take from me yet." Colt nodded slow, like her answer had confirmed something he'd already suspected about her. "Then I reckon I could stop by now and again if you'd allow it. Help where I can." "Why? What's a drifter want with helping a widow and a sick cow he's got no stake in?" He was quiet a moment, jaw working like he was deciding how much truth to hand over to a stranger. "Lost my own place a few years back. Bank took it after my wife passed, and I couldn't keep up with the note grief making a man careless with the little things that matter. Nobody offered to help me then. Watched it all get auctioned off, same as that cow near got sold for slaughter." He looked at her steady. "Reckon I know what it looks like when somebody's fighting a battle everybody else has already decided they've lost." Eliza studied him a long moment, searching his face for the con she was certain must be hiding somewhere in it. She didn't find one, just a tired, quiet kind of honesty that made her chest ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. "All right," she said finally. "You can come by, but I'm not paying you, Mr. Bishop. I don't have it to give." "Wasn't asking for payment, ma'am." "Then what are you asking for?" He looked at the cow, then back at her. "Maybe just a place where the work I do still means something to somebody." Word traveled fast in a county that small, and by the following afternoon, half the town seemed to know that the widow Hartwell had bought Silas Boone's cast-off cow, and that a stranger had been seen tending to it alongside her. Eliza felt the weight of the whispers every time she rode into town for what little she could still afford, felt eyes following her down the main street, heard the word fool pass between women pretending they thought she couldn't hear. She was loading the last of her flour into the wagon when Silas Boone's shadow fell across her. "Heard you've got yourself a hired hand now, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, that same easy smile fixed in place. "Didn't figure you had money for that either." "He's not hired. He's helping. Men don't help widows for free, Eliza. Not in my experience." He stepped closer, lowering his voice like he was doing her some kindness by keeping this part quiet. "I'll make you an offer. Final one. I'll take that mortgage note off the bank's hands myself, give you and your drifter 30 days to clear out, and I'll pay you a fair price for the land. More than fair considering the state of it." "That land isn't for sale. That land is drowning, same as that cow was before you dragged her home. Difference is, a cow can't sign papers. You can." He tipped his hat, the gesture somehow more insulting than any words could have been. 30 days, Mrs. Hartwell. After that, I stop being generous." He walked away before she could answer, and Eliza stood there, gripping the edge of her wagon so tight her knuckles went white, fighting the urge to either scream or cry, unable to decide which one her body wanted more.
Jasor.
By the end of the first week, Patience had begun to change. Small things at first. She ate with more appetite, drank deeper, held her head a little higher when Eliza approached with the feed bucket each morning. Colt came by most days, sometimes just for an hour, showing Eliza how to mix a soft mash that wouldn't hurt the cow's worn teeth, how to check for fever, how to read the animal's mood in the flick of an ear or the set of her tail. "You've got a gentle hand with her," Colt said one morning, watching Eliza brush the worst of the mats from Patience's coat. "She trusts you already. That doesn't happen fast, not with an animal that's been treated poor. Maybe she just recognizes another creature that's had a rough year." Colt almost smiled at that. Maybe so. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Bishop?" Colt's fine. "Colt, then, why do you really keep coming back? A cow getting better, that's a slow business. Most men would have lost interest by now, moved on to somewhere with a bit more excitement in it." He was quiet a moment, running his hand along the cow's flank. "Told you already. Nobody helped me when I needed it. Figured the least I could do was be the kind of man I wished had shown up for me." "That's a fine answer, but it ain't the whole one." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression made her regret asking, not because it upset her, but because it felt like standing too close to a fire she wasn't ready to feel the warmth of yet. "Maybe I like watching a woman refuse to quit when the whole world's telling her she should," he said finally. "Don't see much of that these days." Eliza felt her face go warm and busied herself with the brush, unwilling to let him see how much those words had landed. "Well, don't go getting sentimental about it. This is still just a sick cow in a leaking barn." "Sure it is, ma'am." But he was smiling when he said it, and Eliza found she didn't much mind. It was near the end of the second week when Patience started behaving strange. Eliza noticed it first in the mornings, the cow refusing to graze in the near pasture, the one closest to the house, no matter how good the grass looked. Instead, she'd walk slow and deliberate toward the far corner of the property, near the old dry creek bed that hadn't held water since before Thomas passed. "What's gotten into you?" Eliza muttered, following her out one morning, rope in hand, though she'd stopped needing it days ago. "That ground's no good. Thomas always said that creek bed was cursed dry as a bone, even in the wettest spring." Patience ignored her, walking straight to a patch of ground near a cluster of half-dead cottonwoods, and stopped. Stood there. Wouldn't move. Wouldn't. Colt arrived not long after. Found Eliza standing in the field, watching the cow paw gently at the same spot of earth over and over, low sounds coming from her throat that Eliza had never heard from her before. "She's been doing that near an hour," Eliza said. "Won't graze, won't drink, just keeps pawing at that same spot." Colt crouched down near the ground the cow kept working at, ran his fingers through the disturbed dirt, frowned. "What is it?" Eliza asked. "Ground here's different than the rest of the field. Softer, like it's been dug before not too long ago either, then packed back down." A cold feeling moved through Eliza's chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Dug for what?" Colt didn't answer right away. He kept working the soil with his fingers, careful, until they caught against something buried just beneath the surface, something that wasn't dirt or root or stone. "Eliza," he said, voice low and careful in a way that made her stomach drop. "You're gonna want to come see this." Eliza's legs felt unsteady as she crossed the field, kneeling down beside him in the dirt. Her husband once told her was cursed and worthless. Watching his fingers pull free the edge of something buried, a strip of leather, dark with age and damp earth curling out from the ground like it had been waiting there a long while for somebody to finally come looking. "That's..." Eliza's voice caught in her throat. "That's a saddlebag strap," Colt said quietly. "Somebody buried something out here, Eliza, and I don't think it was long before your husband passed." Above them, Patience let out a low, mournful sound and lowered her head to the disturbed earth, as if she'd been waiting the whole time for somebody besides her to understand what she'd been trying to say. Colt's fingers worked careful at the buried strap, easing more of it free from the packed earth, and Eliza found she couldn't breathe right watching dirt fall away to reveal stitching she recognized before her mind was ready to admit it. "That's Thomas's," she whispered. "That's my husband's saddlebag." "You sure? I stitched that seam myself. Winter before last when the old one tore crossing the river." Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against her knees to stop it. "Thomas said he lost that saddlebag. Said it must have slipped off somewhere out on the range back before he took sick. I never thought twice about it. Well, somebody buried it here on purpose and buried it deep enough that it wasn't going to wash up in the rain." Colt kept digging slow and deliberate until the whole bag came loose from the ground, heavier than it should have been for something that had supposedly been lost on the trail. He set it in the dirt between them and looked at her. "You want me to open it, or you want to—" Eliza stared at the buckle-tarnished green with age and damp, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. "Open it," she said. Colt worked the buckle loose, and the leather flap fell back to reveal a bundle of papers wrapped tight in oilcloth, protected well enough that the ink hadn't run despite months in the ground. He lifted them out, handed them to her without a word. Eliza's hands trembled as she unwrapped the oilcloth, and the first paper she saw made her breath catch hard in her chest. "That's the deed," she said. "That's our land deed. Thomas told me the bank was holding this. Read the rest." She flipped through the papers, her eyes catching pieces at a time her husband's signature, a second signature she didn't recognize, numbers that made her stomach turn over. "This is a loan agreement," she said slowly. "Thomas borrowed money, $200 against the deed to this land 6 months before he passed." She looked up at Colt, confusion and fear tangled together on her face. "I never signed anything like this. I never even knew about it." "Who's the other signature?" Eliza looked back down at the paper, tracing the unfamiliar scrawl with her finger, and felt the ground seem to tilt beneath her when she finally made out the name. Silas Boone. The morning went quiet around them, quiet enough that Eliza could hear Patience breathing heavy behind her, could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. "Boone loaned your husband money?" Colt said slowly, working through it out loud, "and used this land as collateral. And now he's trying to buy the same land off you for a fraction of what it's worth. But the bank holds our mortgage. Thomas told me the bank." "Did you ever see papers from the bank, ever meet with anybody from the bank directly?" Eliza opened her mouth to answer and found she couldn't. She thought back over the last 6 months, over every conversation Thomas had about money in those final weeks, when the fever was already stealing pieces of him, and realized with a sick, hollow feeling that she'd never once seen a banker's face, never once signed a bank document, never once questioned why Thomas always seemed to deal with the dead alone in town, on days she stayed home to mind the animals. "He never let me come with him," she said quietly. "Whenever he went to settle the note, he always went alone. Said it was easier that way. Said I didn't need to trouble myself with numbers." "Eliza." Colt's voice was gentle but firm, the voice of a man choosing his words with care because he could see how close she was to breaking. "I think your husband borrowed money from Silas Boone, not the bank. And I think Boone's been letting you believe otherwise, so he could come in after Thomas passed and buy your land out from under you for next to nothing, all while pretending he's just a neighbor looking to help a struggling widow. Why would Thomas hide something like that from me? Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he thought he'd pay it back before you ever had to know. Man's pride does strange things when he thinks he's protecting his wife." Colt looked down at the papers again. "Or maybe there's more to this than either of us understands yet." Eliza pressed the papers to her chest, feeling the weight of them like a stone, and looked over at Patience, who had finally stopped pawing at the ground, and now stood watching them both with those same dark, patient eyes. "She knew," Eliza whispered. "She led me right to this spot." "Cows don't understand buried paperwork, Eliza." "No, but maybe she understood something was wrong here. Animals sense things people miss." She looked at Colt, something hardening in her face that hadn't been there an hour before. "I need to know the truth. All of it. Before Boone's 30 days run out." "Cha," She rode into town that same afternoon, papers folded careful inside her apron pocket, and found the one man in the county she trusted with something this delicate. Judge Wilhelm Carter, an old friend of Thomas's father, retired now, but still respected enough that folks brought him disputes rather than travel 3 days to the territorial courthouse. He read through the documents twice at his kitchen table, adjusting his spectacles, his frown deepening with every page. "This signature," he said, finally tapping the loan agreement. "You're certain this is your husband's hand?" "I've seen it 1,000 times, Judge. That's Thomas's writing." "And you never signed anything alongside it? Never co-signed this loan?" "Never." The judge set the paper down slow and looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "Mrs. Hartwell, under territorial law, a debt secured against jointly held property generally requires the signature of both parties with claim to that property unless the debt was structured specifically to avoid that requirement. If Silas Boone drew up this loan knowing full well your husband held the land jointly with you and structured it to exclude your knowledge or consent, then what? What does that mean?" "It could mean the loan itself is legally questionable, possibly fraudulent depending on how it was executed. But Mrs. Hartwell, I have to be honest with you. Silas Boone has more money than most banks in this territory, and more influence besides. Challenging this in a courtroom won't be simple, and it won't be quick. I don't have quick. I've got 30 days before he takes my land." The judge was quiet a long moment, tapping his fingers against the table. "There's something else troubling me here. This loan is dated 6 months before your husband's passing. But the ground where you found it, that's been recently disturbed, hasn't it? Within the last year." "That's what Mr. Bishop said. Ground looked freshly dug, then packed back down. Then somebody buried this deliberately and buried it recently, not your husband hiding it before he passed. Which raises a question worth asking, Mrs. Hartwell." He looked at her steady, and something in his expression made the hair on the back of her neck rise. "Who besides you and your late husband would have reason to want that loan agreement hidden yet preserved rather than destroyed?" Eliza felt the floor tilt beneath her a second time that day. "Somebody wanted it found, just not yet." "That would be my thinking, yes." "But who Thomas is gone? Nobody else knew about this." "Somebody knew, Mrs. Hartwell. Somebody buried evidence of a debt they didn't want to disappear entirely, which tells me they may have intended to use it themselves one day, or feared somebody else might come looking eventually and wanted proof it existed." The judge folded his hands. "I'd advise caution. Whoever buried that bag knows something about your husband's dealings with Silas Boone that neither of us currently understands." Eliza rode home slower than she'd ridden in the weight of the judge's words, settling heavy alongside the weight of the papers still tucked against her chest. By the time she reached the homestead, the sun was already dipping low, and she found Colt in the barn, tending Patience's evening feed, the cow noticeably steadier on her feet than she'd been even that morning. "Judge thinks the loan might be fraudulent," she said without preamble, "on account of me never signing it. But he also thinks somebody buried that bag recently, not Thomas before he passed. Somebody wanted it hidden, but not destroyed." Colt straightened, wiping his hands on a rag expression darkening. "That doesn't sit right with me." "Doesn't sit right with me either." Eliza leaned against the stall door, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than the day's riding. Who would do that? Colt? Who else even knew Thomas and Boone had dealings together? Anybody working for Boone might have known. Anybody who helped draw up the paperwork. Could have been a clerk with a conscience, or somebody looking to protect themselves down the line. Or somebody wanting to hurt Boone eventually once the time was right. Colt considered that nodding slow. Either way, somebody out there knows more than they're saying. And that same somebody knew exactly where your land sits, knew that creek bed well enough to bury something there and expect it might surface eventually. He paused. "Eliza, I don't like this. Somebody's playing a longer game than either of us can see the whole shape of yet." Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats on the lane made them both go still. Eliza's stomach dropped when she recognized the horse, not Boone's, but one belonging to Deputy Marshal Ray Finch, the closest thing this stretch of territory had to law enforcement, a man known more for keeping the peace with Boone's interests in mind than with anybody else's. Evening, Mrs. Hartwell. Finch swung down off his horse, slow hat, pulled low expression, carefully blank in the way of a man delivering news he didn't particularly want to deliver. Got a complaint filed against you this afternoon. A complaint? For what? Silas Boone's claiming you've got stolen property on your premises. Says a saddlebag went missing off his land some months back, containing personal papers of significant value. Says word reached him you might have recently come into possession of exactly such an item. The air went cold around Eliza, despite the warm evening. That saddlebag was buried on my property, Marshal. Buried in the ground of land my husband and I have owned outright for near 10 years. That may be, ma'am, but Mr. Boone's prepared to swear otherwise, and he's got 2 witnesses ready to testify. The bag was taken from his property under suspicious circumstances. Finch's eyes flicked toward Colt, lingering there with obvious suspicion. And I understand you've got yourself a drifter living on your land now, too. No offense meant, mister, but strangers showing up right around the time property starts going missing tends to raise questions. He's helping me tend a sick animal, Marshal. Nothing more. Sure, ma'am, but I'll need to take that saddlebag and those papers into custody pending review. Mr. Boone's within his rights to request that given the accusation. Eliza felt fury rise hot and fast in her chest, the kind of anger she hadn't let herself feel fully since Thomas's funeral. Those papers prove your Mr. Boone loaned my husband money and structured the debt specifically so I'd never know about it. Judge Carter himself said the loan might be fraudulent. That gave Finch pause just for a moment, something flickering behind his careful expression. But he recovered quick. That's a matter for the courts to decide, Mrs. Hartwell, not for me standing in your yard at supper time. I'll need those papers. And if I refuse, then I'll have to return with proper authority to take them by force, and that won't reflect well on you when this does go before a judge. He held out his hand, patient, certain of his own authority, in a way that made Eliza's skin crawl. She looked at Colt, saw the tension coiled tight in his jaw, saw him giving her the smallest shake of his head. Not now, the gesture said, not this way, slowly feeling like she was handing over a piece of her own chest. Eliza withdrew the papers from her apron and placed them in the marshal's outstretched hand. You tell Silas Boone, she said, voice shaking with barely contained rage, that I know exactly what he did, and I intend to prove it. Finch tucked the papers into his saddlebag without comment, tipped his hat, and rode off into the gathering dusk, leaving Eliza standing in her own yard, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her a third time that day. They took the evidence, she said barely above a whisper. Colt, they took the only proof I had. Not the only proof. Colt's voice was steady, careful. The judge saw those papers with his own eyes. He can testify to what he read even without the documents in hand, and whoever buried that bag knew what was in it. If we can find out who that was, we might find another way to prove what Boone did. And if we can't... Colt didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Eliza felt real fear settle into her bones for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Then we've got 26 days, he said finally, to figure out how to save your home without that paperwork, and I don't intend to let that happen. Che. The following morning brought a visitor Eliza hadn't expected and hadn't particularly wanted. Silas Boone himself riding up the lane with 2 of his hands trailing behind, an expression of practiced sympathy fixed on his face, like a man arriving to console a widow rather than to threaten one. Mrs. Hartwell. He dismounted slow, surveying the property with the eyes of a man already calculating its worth. Heard about the unfortunate business with the marshal yesterday. Terrible misunderstanding, I'm sure. There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Boone. You accused me of theft to seize documents that prove you defrauded my husband. His expression didn't shift, not even slightly. Strong words for a grieving widow to be throwing around. I'd be careful with accusations like that, Mrs. Hartwell. Slander's a serious charge in this territory. Truth isn't slander, no. But unproven claims from a woman known to be under considerable strain since her husband's passing might look a great deal like desperation to a judge. He smiled, and Eliza felt the full weight of how dangerous that smile really was, dressed up as it was in polite concern. I've come with a gesture of goodwill, actually. Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to extend your deadline. 60 days instead of 30, and I'll forgive the difference between the loan amount and a fair market price for the land. I'm not selling. You don't have much choice in the matter, Mrs. Hartwell. That loan is legally binding whether or not you knew about it, and I've got the marshal's office prepared to enforce collection if you continue to resist. He glanced past her toward the barn toward Patience, visible through the open doorway, noticeably stronger than she'd looked at the auction just weeks before. Interesting. Didn't figure that old cow would live long enough for anyone to notice the improvement. She's not old Mr. Boone. She was starving. There's a difference between broken and abandoned. Something flickered across his face, then something Eliza couldn't quite name gone as quick as it appeared. Careful, Mrs. Hartwell. Sentiment doesn't pay debts. Neither does fraud, Mr. Boone. But I intend to make sure it costs you plenty before this is finished. For just a moment, something like genuine anger cracked through his composure, and Eliza saw underneath the polished manners and easy smiles a man far more dangerous than the county gave him credit for. 60 days, he said, voice tight now, all pretense of warmth gone. After that, I take the land, whether you've packed your things or not. He mounted his horse and rode off without another word, his two hands following silent behind him. And Eliza stood in her yard, shaking with an anger so complete, it left no room for the fear she'd been carrying just moments before. That evening, working alongside Colt to mend the last of the pasture fence, Eliza found herself circling back to the buried papers, unable to let the mystery rest. Somebody wanted Boone exposed eventually, she said, hammering a nail with more force than the task required. But not yet. Why not yet? Maybe they were waiting for something, building a case of their own, same as you're trying to now. Or maybe they were scared of what Boone might do if he found out who'd taken it. Colt set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow, considering that. You said your husband never let you come with him to settle the debt. Always went alone into town. That's right. Who'd he usually see when he went in? Anybody specific? Eliza thought back, trying to recall details she'd never had reason to examine closely before. He'd usually be gone most of the day, said he had business at the bank, but you're right, I never once saw a receipt with the bank's name on it. She frowned, something surfacing slow from memory. There was a clerk, though. Young fellow worked at the land office in town, used to help Thomas file paperwork on the homestead years back when we first settled here. Thomas mentioned him a few times, said he was decent, said he'd helped him understand some complicated filing once. You remember his name? Daniel. Daniel Whitfield, I believe. Haven't thought of him in years. Might be worth paying him a visit. The following morning they rode into town together, and Eliza found the land office exactly where she remembered it, tucked between the general store and the assay office, though the young clerk she recalled had aged considerably in the years since she'd last had cause to visit. Daniel Whitfield looked up from his ledger when the bell above the door announced them, and something in his expression shifted the moment he recognized her. A flicker of guilt quickly smoothed over. Mrs. Hartwell, been some time. It has, Mr. Whitfield. I understand you helped my husband with paperwork a few times over the years. I helped a great many people with paperwork, ma'am. It's the nature of the position. Did you help him with a loan he took from Silas Boone 6 months before he passed? The color drained slow from Daniel Whitfield's face, and his hands went still against the ledger in front of him. I don't know what you're referring to, Mrs. Hartwell. I think you do, Mr. Whitfield. I think you know exactly what I'm referring to, and I think the guilt written all over your face right now confirms it. He glanced toward the door, toward the window facing the street, as though checking whether anyone might be watching, then lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hartwell, I can't discuss this here. Then where can we discuss it? Not here. Not in town. He hesitated, glancing once more at Colt, standing silent and watchful beside her. There's a stand of trees along the north road, half a mile past the church. Meet me there tonight after dark. I'll tell you what I know. But you have to understand, Mrs. Hartwell Silas Boone is not a man to be trifled with, And if he learns I've spoken to you, my position here, possibly my safety will be at considerable risk. I understand. Do you, because I'm not certain you fully grasp what you're stepping into? His eyes were wide now, genuine fear replacing the careful professional mask he'd worn moments before. Your husband didn't just borrow money from Silas Boone, Mrs. Hartwell. There's more to it than that. Far more. Before Eliza could press further, the bell above the door chimed again, and both of them went rigid as Deputy Marshal Finch stepped inside, his eyes moving between them with obvious suspicion. Mrs. Hartwell, didn't expect to find you here. Just settling some old business, Marshal. Finch's gaze lingered on Daniel Whitfield a moment too long, and Eliza saw the clerk's composure crack slightly under that scrutiny. That's so. Well, Mr. Boone did ask me to keep an eye toward any unusual activity concerning your husband's affairs, Mrs. Hartwell, given the ongoing dispute. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings to complicate matters further. The threat was thin as paper and twice as clear, and Eliza felt her pulse quicken with something close to real fear for the first time since this whole business had begun. No misunderstandings here, Marshal, she said, keeping her voice level with effort. Just an old widow settling old business. She left the land office with Colt close behind, and neither of them spoke until they were well clear of the main street. That clerk's terrified, Colt said quietly. Whatever he knows, it's bad enough that just talking about it's got him looking over his shoulder. Tonight, Eliza said. We meet him tonight. The stand of trees along the north road sat black and silent under a moon, just past full, and Eliza found herself grateful for Colt's presence beside her, his rifle resting easy across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows around them. You sure about this? He asked quietly as they waited in the darkness. No, but I need to know the truth whatever it costs. They heard the horse before they saw it moving, cautious and slow through the trees, and Daniel Whitfield emerged finally into the thin moonlight, his own eyes darting nervous toward every shadow. Mrs. Hartwell, I wasn't certain you'd actually come. I told you I would. He dismounted, hands trembling slightly as he tied his horse to a low branch, and for a long moment he simply stood there, gathering himself, before finally speaking. Your husband didn't come to me for help filing a homestead claim, Mrs. Hartwell. Not the last time he visited 6 months before he passed. He came to me because he'd discovered something, and he didn't know who else to trust with it. Discovered what? Daniel Whitfield glanced once more into the surrounding darkness, before continuing, his voice dropping lower still. Silas Boone has been systematically loaning money to struggling homesteaders across this county for the past 3 years, structuring the loans deliberately to avoid requiring spousal signatures, specifically targeting families where he suspected the husband might not survive long enough to repay the debt in full. Eliza felt something cold and sick twist in her stomach. You're saying he's doing this on purpose, targeting sick men, dying men. I'm saying your husband found records, financial records that suggested exactly that pattern. Men with failing health families in difficult circumstances, all offered loans structured the same way, all eventually losing their land to Boone when the debt came due, and the widow had no knowledge of it to contest. He swallowed hard. Your husband found 3 other families in this same situation before you, Mrs. Hartwell. 3 other pieces of land Boone acquired through the exact same method. Where are these records now? Your husband had copies. He was building a case, planning to bring it before the territorial court exposed the whole scheme. But then he took sick himself faster than anyone expected and... Daniel Whitfield's voice broke slightly. I helped him hide those copies before he passed Mrs. Hartwell along with the original loan agreement concerning your own land. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to make sure you eventually discovered the truth once enough time had passed, that Boone wouldn't suspect where it came from. You buried that bag. I did. Recently, once I felt confident enough time had passed that suspicion wouldn't fall immediately on me. I hoped you might find it eventually on your own land in a way that couldn't be traced back to me. Eliza felt tears burning hot behind her eyes, grief and fury tangled together so completely she could barely separate them. Thomas knew. He knew Boone was going to come for our land eventually, and he never told me. He was trying to protect you, Mrs. Hartwell. He was afraid if you knew too soon, you might confront Boone directly before he'd gathered enough evidence to protect you properly, and that Boone might retaliate before the case could be made. Where are the rest of those records? The ones about the other families? Daniel Whitfield hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eliza saw real terror flicker across his face. That's the part I haven't told you yet, Mrs. Hartwell, and I'm afraid it complicates things considerably. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind them, and all three of them went rigid, Colt's hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. "Who's there?" Colt called, voice low and sharp. Silence answered him, thick and heavy, until finally, a figure emerged from the tree line, and Eliza's blood turned to ice when she recognized the shape of Deputy Marshal Finch's rifle already raised. "Evening, folks," Finch said, voice cold now, none of the practiced neutrality from earlier remaining. "Mr. Boone figured you might come sniffing around eventually, Whitfield. Man's been watching you close for months." "Marshal, this is a private conversation." "Was a private conversation. Mr. Boone's gonna want to know exactly what's been discussed here tonight." His eyes moved to Eliza, hard and unfriendly, in a way that made her chest tighten with real fear. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm gonna need you and your drifter to come with me. Mr. Boone's got some questions he'd like answered directly." "On what authority, Marshal? We haven't broken any law." "On the authority of a badge and a rifle, Mrs. Hartwell, which is generally all the authority a man needs out here." He gestured with the barrel toward their horses. "Let's not make this difficult." Colt's body had gone tense and still beside her, and Eliza could feel the barely restrained violence coiled in him, the same protective instinct she'd glimpsed the very first evening he'd ridden up her lane. "Marshal," Colt said, voice deceptively calm, "you really want to do this? Point a rifle at an unarmed woman over a private conversation." "I want to do my job, mister, and my job right now is making sure Mr. Boone gets answers he's owed." Finch's finger tightened slightly against the trigger guard. "Now, mount up all three of you nice and slow." Daniel Whitfield's face had gone pale as ash, and Eliza saw his hands trembling visibly, even in the dim moonlight. "Marshal, please," he said, voice cracking. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You've done plenty wrong. Whitfield and Mr. Boone's gonna want to discuss every bit of it personally." Finch's eyes flicked back to Eliza, something almost like an apology flickering briefly across his hardened expression. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Mrs. Hartwell. I truly am. But I've got a family to feed, same as anybody. And Silas Boone signs my wages one way or another." The moment stretched taut and dangerous. 3 lives suddenly balanced on the thin edge of one frightened lawman's choice, and Eliza realized with sudden clarity that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine far more than just the fate of her land. It would determine whether any of them survived to see morning at all. Colt's hand didn't move from his side, but his voice when it came carried a weight that made even Finch's rifle waver slightly. "Marshal, think real careful before you do something you can't take back. There's a judge in town who's already seen those loan papers, a witness who can testify to what was in them. You put a bullet in any of us tonight, that's not a private matter anymore. That's murder, and murder's got a way of finding its way back to the man who ordered it." "Nobody said anything about bullets, mister." "Then lower the rifle." The silence stretched thin enough to snap. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Daniel Whitfield's ragged breathing beside her, could hear the horses shifting nervous in the darkness at the smell of fear thick in the air. "Marshal Finch." Eliza kept her voice steady, though her hands were shaking at her sides. "You've got a wife, a little girl if I recall right over at the schoolhouse. What happens to them if you put a bullet in an innocent woman tonight over Silas Boone's debts? You think he'll stand beside you in a courtroom when it comes to that? Man like Boone doesn't protect the people who do his dirty work. He protects himself." Something shifted behind Finch's eyes, some crack forming in the resolve that had been holding his rifle steady. "Get on your horses," he said finally, voice rougher now. "All of you. We're riding to Boone's ranch. That's all I'm doing tonight, delivering you to talk. What happens after that isn't my business. And if we refuse, then I do my job the hard way, Mrs. Hartwell, and none of us want that." Eliza looked at Colt, saw the barely restrained fury in his jaw, saw him weighing the odds of 3 unarmed people against 1 nervous man with a rifle in the dark. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not tonight. Not like this. We'll come," she said. "But you tell Boone this. Whatever he thinks he's protecting by dragging us out there tonight, it's already too late. The judge knows. The truth doesn't stay buried forever, Marshal. Not even when men like Boone pay good money to keep it in the ground." The ride to Boone's ranch felt longer than any distance Eliza had traveled in her life, every hoofbeat carrying her closer to a confrontation she wasn't certain she'd survive. Colt rode close beside her the whole way, near enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a stove, near enough that when her hands finally started shaking too hard to hold the reins steady, he reached over without a word and steadied them himself. "Whatever happens in there," he said low, meant only for her, "you don't back down. Boone respects fear. Feed him fear and you've already lost." "I'm not afraid of him." "I know. Make sure he sees that too." Boone's ranch house rose up out of the darkness, like something built to intimidate rather than to live in all sharp lines and lamplight blazing from every window, and Eliza felt her stomach twist tight as Finch led them up the front steps and through the door without so much as a knock. Silas Boone was waiting in his study, a glass of amber liquor in one hand, an expression of practiced calm arranged across his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Bishop, and Daniel." His gaze lingered longest on the clerk, cold and assessing. "Didn't expect to see the 3 of you together tonight out past the church road at such a curious hour." "You had us dragged here at gunpoint," Eliza said. "Whatever you want to say it plain." Boone's smile flickered thin and dangerous. "Direct as ever. Very well." He set down his glass, moved slow around his desk, every gesture calculated for effect. "I understand you've discovered some papers, Mrs. Hartwell. Papers concerning a loan agreement between myself and your late husband." "I've discovered fraud, Mr. Boone. A loan structured specifically to keep me ignorant of its existence, filed against land you knew perfectly well was owned jointly by a husband and wife. Fraud is a strong word. So is theft, but that's exactly what you attempted when you sent the marshal to seize evidence proving what you did." Boone's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack in his composure since they'd arrived. He turned his attention to Daniel Whitfield, who stood pale and trembling near the doorway. "You helped bury that saddlebag," Boone said quietly. "Didn't you, Daniel?" "Mr. Boone, I don't know what you're—" "Don't." The word cracked like a whip, and Whitfield flinched visibly. "I've had you watched for months. Ever since Thomas Hartwell started asking questions he had no business asking. I know you helped him gather those records. I know you've been waiting for the right moment to expose me." Boone stepped closer, voice dropping to something cold and quiet that frightened Eliza more than any shout could have. "What I don't know is how many copies exist and where they're hidden. That's what tonight is for." "There's nothing to find," Whitfield said, though his voice shook badly enough that the lie was obvious to everyone in the room. "Thomas never showed me anything." "Marshal." Boone didn't even look at Finch. "Search his office at the Land Bureau tomorrow morning, thoroughly." "You have no authority to search my office," Whitfield protested. "I have every authority in this county, Daniel. You'd do well to remember that." Boone turned back to Eliza, and something in his eyes had gone entirely cold, now all pretense of civility stripped away. "As for you, Mrs. Hartwell, I'm prepared to make this simple. Sign over the land tonight, and I'll forget this entire unpleasant business. The loan, the papers, all of it disappears. You take a fair settlement and start fresh somewhere else far from here, where the memory of your husband's debts won't follow you. And if I refuse, then I'll be forced to pursue this through proper legal channels, and I promise you, Mrs. Hartwell, I have considerably more resources for that fight than you do. I'll drag this out until you've spent every last cent defending yourself, until that cow you rescued dies of old age, waiting for the courts to decide, until this drifter of yours grows tired of a battle that was never his to fight in the first place." His eyes flicked to Colt, something almost mocking in his expression. "Men like him don't stay, Mrs. Hartwell. They wander and offer help when it costs them nothing, and wander out again the moment the wind shifts. Don't mistake his kindness for permanence. Eliza felt something white-hot rise in her chest, and before she could stop herself, the words came out sharp and clear. You buried 3 other families the same way you're trying to bury me, Mr. Boone. Thomas found them. Found the pattern. Sick men, dying men, loans structured so their wives would never see them coming. You've been doing this for years, picking off the weakest families in this county, like a wolf culling a herd. The room went utterly silent. Even Finch, still standing near the door with his rifle lowered, now looked visibly shaken. Boone's composure cracked fully for the first time, something ugly and desperate flashing across his face before he forced it back down. You have no proof of any such pattern. Not yet. But I will. You have nothing, Mrs. Hartwell. A single loan document that the marshal already confiscated, and the word of a terrified clerk who will say whatever keeps him employed. Boone's voice had risen now sharp with something close to panic beneath the fury. Whatever fantasy your husband constructed before he died, it dies with this conversation. Do you understand me? I understand you're frightened, Mr. Boone. Men don't threaten this hard unless they're afraid of what happens if they don't. For a moment, Eliza thought he might actually strike her, the rage in his face, so raw and sudden, that even Colt shifted forward half a step, ready to intervene. But Boone caught himself breathing hard and stepped back instead. Get out of my house, he said quietly. All of you. You have until the end of the week to reconsider my offer, Mrs. Hartwell. After that, I promise you the consequences will be considerably less generous. They rode home in silence, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavy over all 3 of them, until Daniel Whitfield finally broke it, his voice barely steady. He's going to search my office tomorrow. If he finds anything at all connecting me to those records, I'm finished. Might be worse than finished. Then we need to find them first, Colt said. Before he does. I don't have them anymore, I told you. I buried the 1 bag on Mrs. Hartwell's land. That's everything I had. But you said Thomas found 3 other families, Eliza pressed. Records of other loans. Where would those be? Whitfield was quiet a long moment, thinking hard fear and exhaustion plain on his face. There's a strongbox. Thomas kept it hidden at the old mill, the abandoned one along Miller's Creek, before he passed. He didn't trust keeping everything in one place, not once he realized how much danger the information carried. I only knew about the saddlebag because he asked me specifically to hold on to that piece after he took sick, worried he wouldn't recover in time to handle it himself. The old mill, Eliza repeated. I know that place. Thomas used to go out there sometimes, said he liked the quiet. If there's more evidence, it's there. But Mrs. Hartwell, if Boone learns you're looking, if he even suspects... He already suspects everything, Daniel. That's exactly why he had us dragged out here tonight. Colt's voice was grim. We don't have time to be careful anymore. We ride out to that mill first thing before Boone's men think to search it themselves. Dawn found the 3 of them approaching the old mill, its wheel long since stopped turning, its walls weathered gray with years of neglect. Eliza's heart hammered as they searched through the abandoned structure, sifting through decades of dust and forgotten debris. Until finally, Colt's hand struck something solid beneath a loose floorboard near what had once been the miller's office. Here, he said, voice tight with urgency. Eliza, come look at this. The strongbox was heavier than it looked, rusted at the hinges, but intact, and when Eliza finally forced it open with a length of iron Colt found nearby, her breath caught hard in her chest at what lay inside. Dozens of documents carefully organized, each one detailing a different family, a different loan, the same pattern repeating over and over in Thomas's careful handwriting alongside official-looking papers bearing Boone's signature. He documented everything, Eliza whispered. Every family, every loan. Dates, amounts, terms, all of it. This is enough, Whitfield said, awe and fear mingling in his voice. This is more than enough to bring before the territorial court. This proves a pattern, Mrs. Hartwell, deliberate and repeated. This isn't just fraud against one widow. This is a scheme that's destroyed 6 families across this county. Before the relief could fully settle, the sound of approaching riders shattered the morning quiet, and Eliza's blood ran cold as she recognized Boone's men cresting the ridge above the mill, at least 4 of them moving fast. "They followed us," Colt said grimly, already moving to block the doorway. "Eliza, get that strongbox out the back, now." "What about you?" "I'll hold them as long as I can. Go." "Colt, I'm not leaving you." "Eliza." His eyes met hers, fierce and steady, despite the danger closing in around them. "That evidence is the only thing that can save your land, save those other families, prove what Boone did to your husband. It matters more than either of us right now. Go." The riders were closing fast, and Eliza felt the terrible weight of the choice pressing down on her, torn between the man who'd stood beside her through every impossible moment of the past weeks and the truth that could finally set her free. Daniel Whitfield grabbed her arm, urgency plain in his face. "Mrs. Hartwell, he's right. We have to move. There's a back trail through the trees, leads down toward the creek. If we can reach town before they catch us, reach the judge." The first shot rang out before he could finish splintering wood somewhere above their heads, and Eliza's decision was made for her, as Colt shoved her hard toward the back exit, his own rifle already raised toward the approaching riders. "Go!" he shouted, voice raw with urgency. "I'll catch up. I promise you, Eliza, I will catch up." She ran strongbox clutched tight against her chest. Whitfield close behind her, the sound of gunfire and shouting fading slowly as they pushed deeper into the trees along the creek, her heart breaking with every step that carried her further from the man she was leaving behind to face Boone's men alone. Eliza ran until her lungs burned, until the strongbox felt like it weighed as much as her whole grief, until the gunfire behind her faded into scattered distant cracks that told her nothing about whether Colt was still standing. Whitfield stayed close at her side, urging her forward every time her steps faltered. "Don't stop," he gasped. "Mrs. Hartwell, if they catch us with this box, everything Thomas built is gone." "I'm not stopping." Her voice came out fierce, despite the tears blurring her vision. "But if Colt, he told you to go, trust that he knew what he was doing." They broke from the tree line near the edge of town, just as the sun cleared the ridge, and Eliza's chest heaved with relief and terror in equal measure when she spotted Judge Carter's modest house at the end of the street lamp, already lit in his front window, despite the early hour. The judge opened the door before she could knock alarm, crossing his face at the sight of her disheveled state, the strongbox clutched desperate in her arms. "Mrs. Hartwell, what in God's name?" "Judge, I need you to look at this right now, please." He ushered them inside quickly, and Eliza spread the contents of the strongbox across his kitchen table, with trembling hands watching his expression shift from confusion to shock, to something like grim satisfaction as he worked through document after document. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles, tracing lines of Thomas's careful notation. 6 families. 6 loans, all structured identically, all excluding spousal knowledge, all time to come due shortly after the husband's declining health made repayment impossible. He looked up at her, something fierce kindling behind his tired eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is no longer a simple property dispute. This is a documented pattern of predatory fraud, and with evidence this thorough, I believe we have more than enough to bring formal charges before the territorial court." "There's no time for territorial court, Judge. Boone's men are chasing us right now. Colt stayed behind to hold them off at the old mill." The judge's face hardened with new urgency. "Then we move immediately. I'll ride for the sheriff's office in the county seat myself, request federal marshals if necessary, given the scope of what's documented here. Silas Boone has clearly overstepped whatever local influence he's purchased through Deputy Finch." He was already reaching for his coat, moving with surprising speed for a man of his years. "Mrs. Hartwell, you and Mr. Whitfield need to stay somewhere safe. Boone will not react well once he realizes this evidence has reached beyond his control. I'm not hiding while Colt's out there facing gunfire alone." "Mrs. Hartwell, with respect, Judge, I've spent months letting men decide what's safest for me. I'm done with that." She was already moving toward the door. "I'm going back for him." She found her own horse tied where she'd left it near the church and rode hard back toward the old mill, Whitfield's warnings chasing after her uselessly on the wind. The closer she got, the tighter her chest wound, until finally the mill came into view and her heart nearly stopped at what she saw. Colt was down. Not dead, she told herself fiercely, refusing to accept anything else as she threw herself off her horse and ran toward where he lay, slumped against the mill's outer wall. Blood soaking dark through his shirt at the shoulder. Two of Boone's men standing over him with rifles still raised. "Get away from him!" she screamed, and something in her voice must have carried enough raw fury that both men actually startled, turning toward her, with surprise plain on their faces. "Mrs. Hartwell, this doesn't concern you. He's bleeding. Get away from him now, or so help me." "Or what?" The larger of the two men sneered, stepping toward her with his rifle lowering to point in her direction instead. "You gonna threaten us too, same as you threatened Mr. Boone?" Eliza didn't have a weapon, didn't have anything but raw, desperate fury, and the absolute certainty that she would not lose another person she loved to this county's cruelty. She was still searching for words for anything that might buy her a few more seconds when the sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered up behind her. Judge Carter arrived first, followed close by three riders Eliza didn't immediately recognize, badges gleaming on their vests in the morning light. "Territorial marshals," the judge called out, breathless from the ride. "I sent word ahead before I ever came to your door, Mrs. Hartwell. Suspected we might need them before this was finished." Boone's men exchanged a look of pure panic, rifles lowering slowly as the marshals closed the distance, and within moments they were disarmed and restrained, sputtering protests that nobody bothered to listen to. Eliza didn't wait for any of it. She dropped to her knees beside Colt, hands shaking as she pressed against the wound in his shoulder relief, nearly buckling her, when his eyes fluttered open and focused hazy but alive on her face. "Told you," he rasped, voice weak but carrying a ghost of his usual dry humor. "I'd catch up." "You absolute fool," she said, half laughing, half sobbing, tears finally breaking free after weeks of holding them back. "You could have died. Wasn't gonna let them take that box. Wasn't gonna let them take you either." His hand found hers, weak but certain. Figured between those two options, taking a bullet seemed the better trade. "Don't you dare make jokes right now." "Ma'am, with respect, it's the only thing keeping me from passing out from the pain." The days that followed moved in a blur. Eliza would later struggle to fully piece together. Colt survived his wound, the bullet having missed anything vital, though the doctor in town warned it would be weeks before he had full use of his arm again. Judge Carter, true to his word, brought the full weight of the documented evidence before territorial authorities, and within a week, federal marshals arrived to formally investigate the pattern of fraud spanning 6 families across the county. Silas Boone did not go quietly. He fought the charges with every resource his money could purchase. Hired lawyers from as far away as the territorial capital attempted repeatedly to discredit the evidence, to paint Thomas Hartwell as a bitter, dying man, inventing conspiracies out of jealousy and failing health. But the pattern was too thorough, too carefully documented, and one by one, the other families named in Thomas's records came forward, each with their own story of a loan they'd never fully understood, a debt structured to exclude the very people who deserved to know about it. Deputy Marshal Finch, faced with formal testimony requirements and the very real possibility of federal charges for his own role in suppressing evidence, finally broke under the pressure and testified fully against Boone, describing years of intimidation and manipulation that Boone had used to maintain control over both the law and the county's most vulnerable families. The trial itself, when it finally came, drew crowds from across the territory, townsfolk who'd once laughed at Eliza's foolishness, now watching in stunned silence as the full scope of Boone's cruelty was laid bare before the court. Eliza testified last, her voice steady, despite the weight of every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. "My husband spent the last months of his life," she said, "not fighting for himself but fighting for justice he wouldn't live to see. He gathered evidence at the cost of his own peace, hid it because he was afraid of what a man like Silas Boone might do if he learned too soon. He died protecting people he'd never even met, families who'd suffered the same fraud we suffered." Her eyes found Boone across the courtroom, and she did not look away. Mr. Boone built his fortune on the backs of dying men and grieving widows, betting that grief would make us too weak, too distracted, too broken to notice what he'd done. He was wrong. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts of fraud, guilty of falsifying legal documents, guilty of conspiracy to defraud multiple families of their land and livelihood. The judge sentenced Boone to the maximum term allowed under territorial law and ordered full restitution to every family he'd wronged, including the return of land already seized from 2 families who'd lost everything in the years before Thomas ever discovered the pattern. Silas Boone's ranch, his cattle, his carefully built empire of fear and manipulation, all of it dismantled within a matter of months, sold off to satisfy the restitution owed to the families he'd destroyed. Eliza stood in her own yard on the day the final papers arrived, confirming her land was fully and legally hers, free of any claim Boone or his estate might have pressed and found. She couldn't quite believe how light her chest felt after months of carrying fear like a stone lodged beneath her ribs. Patience grazed nearby, fully recovered. Now her coat sleek and glossy, her steps sure and strong. Utterly transformed from the starving, broken creature nobody had wanted just months before. Colt worked beside the barn. His shoulder healed enough now that he'd insisted on helping with repairs, despite Eliza's protests that he ought to rest a while longer. "You keep working like that," she called over to him. "Folks are going to start wondering if you're planning on sticking around permanent." Colt set down his hammer, turning to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with grief or fear anymore. "Would that trouble you?" he asked. "Me sticking around?" "Depends on your reasons for staying, Mr. Bishop." He crossed the yard slow, the same unhurried pace he'd carried the very first evening he'd ridden up her lane, and stopped close enough that Eliza had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. "My reasons," he said quietly, "have gotten a good deal more complicated than fixing fences and doctoring a sick cow, Mrs. Hartwell. I expect you've noticed that same as I have." "I might have noticed something along those lines, yes." "Then I reckon I ought to just say it plain, seeing as you're a woman who's never had much patience for men dancing around the truth." His hand found hers, careful and warm. "I've buried my own share of grief, same as you. Watched everything I built get taken, same as you nearly did. But somewhere between mending that fence and watching you refuse to quit when the whole world told you that you should, I stopped feeling like a man just passing through." Eliza felt tears rise again, different this time, warm instead of bitter. "Thomas has only been gone a year, Colt." "I know it. Wouldn't ask you to forget him, wouldn't want to, even if I could. Man built something worth remembering, worth honoring." His thumb traced gentle across her knuckles. "But grief and love aren't enemies, Eliza. Reckon there's room enough in a person's heart for both if she's willing to make space." Behind them, Patience let out a low, contented sound, and Eliza found herself laughing through her tears, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Colt. "Even she approves," Eliza said. "Seems only fitting, given she's the reason we ever crossed paths at all." "Then I reckon we ought to thank her properly," Colt said, "seeing as she's done more matchmaking than most folks manage in a lifetime." Eliza ran until her lungs burned, until the strong box felt like it weighed as much as her whole grief, until the gunfire behind her faded into scattered distant cracks that told her nothing about whether Colt was still standing. Whitfield stayed close at her side, urging her forward every time her steps faltered. "Don't stop," he gasped. "Mrs. Hartwell, if they catch us with this box, everything Thomas built is gone." "I'm not stopping." Her voice came out fierce, despite the tears blurring her vision. "But if Colt, he told you to go. Trust that he knew what he was doing." "Trust isn't the same as certainty, Daniel." "No," he admitted, breathless. "It isn't, but it's what we've got right now." They broke from the tree line near the edge of town, just as the sun cleared the ridge, and Eliza's chest heaved with relief and terror in equal measure when she spotted Judge Carter's modest house at the end of the street lamp, already lit in his front window despite the early hour. The judge opened the door before she could knock alarm. Crossing his face at the sight of her disheveled state, the strongbox clutched desperate in her arms. "Mrs. Hartwell, what in God's name?" "Judge, I need you to look at this right now. Please. There's no time to explain proper." He ushered them inside quickly, glancing once toward the street, as though checking whether they'd been followed, and Eliza spread the contents of the strongbox across his kitchen table with trembling hands, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock to something like grim satisfaction as he worked through document after document. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles, tracing lines of Thomas's careful notation. 6 families, 6 loans, all structured identically, all excluding spousal knowledge, all time to come due shortly after the husband's declining health made repayment impossible. He looked up at her, something fierce kindling behind his tired eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is no longer a simple property dispute. This is a documented pattern of predatory fraud, and with evidence this thorough, I believe we have more than enough to bring formal charges before the territorial court." "There's no time for territorial court, Judge. Boone's men are chasing us right now. Colt stayed behind to hold them off at the old mill." The judge's face hardened with new urgency. "Then we move immediately. I'll ride for the sheriff's office in the county seat myself, request federal marshals if necessary, given the scope of what's documented here. Silas Boone has clearly overstepped whatever local influence he's purchased through Deputy Finch." He was already reaching for his coat, moving with surprising speed for a man of his years. "Mrs. Hartwell, you and Mr. Whitfield need to stay somewhere safe. Boone will not react well once he realizes this evidence has reached beyond his control. I'm not hiding while Colt's out there facing gunfire alone." "Mrs. Hartwell." "With respect, Judge, I've spent months letting men decide what's safest for me. I'm done with that." She was already moving toward the door. "I'm going back for him." "Eliza." Whitfield's voice cracked with fear. "If you ride back there alone—" "I'm not asking permission, Daniel. I'm telling you both where I'm headed. Judge, get those marshals here as fast as horses will carry them. Please." The judge studied her a long moment, something like understanding passing across his weathered face. "There's no talking you out of this, is there?" "No, sir, there isn't." "Then take my rifle at least. It's loaded, hanging by the door. A woman riding into danger unarmed helps nobody." She found her own horse tied where she'd left it near the church, and rode hard back toward the old mill, the judge's rifle heavy and unfamiliar across her lap, Whitfield's warnings chasing after her uselessly on the wind. The closer she got, the tighter her chest wound, until finally the mill came into view, and her heart nearly stopped at what she saw. Colt was down, not dead, she told herself fiercely, refusing to accept anything else as she threw herself off her horse and ran toward where he lay slumped against the mill's outer wall, blood soaking dark through his shirt at the shoulder, 2 of Boone's men standing over him with rifles still raised. "Get away from him!" she screamed, and something in her voice must have carried enough raw fury that both men actually startled, turning toward her with surprise plain on their faces. "Mrs. Hartwell, this doesn't concern you. He's bleeding. Get away from him now, or so help me." "Or what?" The larger of the 2 men sneered, stepping toward her with his rifle lowering to point in her direction instead. "You gonna threaten us too, same as you threatened Mr. Boone?" Eliza raised the judge's rifle, hands shaking so badly she wasn't certain she could hit anything if it came to that, but she held it steady enough to make both men hesitate. "I've never shot a man before," she said, voice trembling but clear, "and I'd rather not start today. But I will, if you take one more step toward him." The 2 men exchanged an uncertain glance, clearly weighing whether a grieving widow's threat carried any real weight behind it, and in that moment of hesitation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered up behind her. Judge Carter arrived first, followed close by 3 riders. Eliza didn't immediately recognize badges gleaming on their vests in the morning light. "Territorial marshals," the judge called out, breathless from the ride. "I sent word ahead before I ever came to your door, Mrs. Hartwell. Suspected we might need them before this was finished." Boone's men exchanged a look of pure panic. Rifles lowering slowly as the marshals closed the distance, and within moments they were disarmed and restrained, sputtering protests that nobody bothered to listen to. Eliza didn't wait for any of it. She dropped the rifle in the dirt and fell to her knees beside Colt's hands, shaking as she pressed against the wound in his shoulder relief, nearly buckling her when his eyes fluttered open and focused hazy but alive on her face. "Told you!" He rasped, voice weak, but carrying a ghost of his usual dry humor. I'd catch up. "You absolute fool," she said, half laughing, half sobbing, tears finally breaking free after weeks of holding them back. "You could have died." Wasn't gonna let them take that box. Wasn't gonna let them take you either. His hand found hers weak but certain. Figured between those two options, taking a bullet seemed the better trade. "Don't you dare make jokes right now. Ma'am, with respect, it's the only thing keeping me from passing out from the pain." One of the marshals crouched beside them, examining the wound with quick, practiced hands. "Bullets through and through, ma'am. Missed the bone from what I can tell. He's gonna need a doctor quick, but I don't think this is fatal provided we move him soon." "Then let's move him," Eliza said, already working to tear a strip from her own petticoat to press harder against the wound. "Now." The ride back to town felt like the longest of Eliza's life. Colt slumped against her conscious, but fading in and out, his breath coming shallow and uneven with every jolt of the horse beneath them. She kept talking to him the whole way, half to keep him awake, half to keep herself from unraveling entirely. "You stay with me, Colt Bishop. You hear me? You didn't survive a bank foreclosure and a bullet in the shoulder just to die on me in the middle of a dusty road. Wouldn't dream of it," he mumbled, barely coherent. "Too stubborn to die before I've had the chance to see how this all turns out." That's the spirit. Eliza. His hand tightened weak around hers. That strong box. Whitfield get it to the judge. He did. Don't you worry about that right now. Worried about you mostly. His eyes fluttered, fighting to stay open. Boone's not gonna let this go easy. Let me worry about Boone. You just worry about staying alive. By the time they reached the doctor's office in town, Colt had gone fully unconscious, and Eliza felt her whole world narrow down to the space of that small examination room. To the doctor's careful hands, working to clean and stitch the wound, to the agonizing wait that followed, while she sat in the hallway outside Strongbox evidence, forgotten entirely in the face of losing the man who'd walked into her life over a dying cow, and never once walked back out. The days that followed moved in a blur. Eliza would later struggle to fully piece together. Colt survived his wound, the bullet having missed anything vital, though the doctor in town warned it would be weeks before he had full use of his arm again. Judge Carter, true to his word, brought the full weight of the documented evidence before territorial authorities, and within a week, federal marshals arrived to formally investigate the pattern of fraud spanning 6 families across the county. Silas Boone did not go quietly. He fought the charges with every resource his money could purchase. Hired lawyers from as far away as the territorial capital, attempted repeatedly to discredit the evidence to paint Thomas Hartwell as a bitter, dying man inventing conspiracies out of jealousy and failing health. He even attempted briefly to claim that Eliza herself had fabricated the documents, a claim that collapsed almost immediately once handwriting experts confirmed Thomas's script alongside Boone's own signature on document after document. But the pattern was too thorough, too carefully documented, and one by one the other families named in Thomas's records came forward, each with their own story of a loan they'd never fully understood, a debt structured to exclude the very people who deserved to know about it. Ruth Callahan, who'd lost her husband to the same slow fever that had taken Thomas, wept openly on the witness stand, describing how she'd learned of her own family's debt only after the land had already been seized. Deputy Marshal Finch, faced with formal testimony requirements and the very real possibility of federal charges for his own role in suppressing evidence, finally broke under the pressure and testified fully against Boone, describing years of intimidation and manipulation that Boone had used to maintain control over both the law and the county's most vulnerable families. "He held a debt of my own over my head," Finch admitted, before the court voice thick with shame. "Threatened to call it due all at once if I didn't cooperate with whatever he asked. I'm not proud of what I did, but I want the record to show I never intended for anybody to be seriously hurt in all this." Yet a man was shot, the prosecuting attorney pressed. "On your watch, following your escort of these witnesses directly into Boone's hands." Finch had no answer for that, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. The trial itself, when it finally came, drew crowds from across the territory. Townsfolk who'd once laughed at Eliza's foolishness, now watching in stunned silence as the full scope of Boone's cruelty was laid bare before the court. Eliza testified last, her voice steady, despite the weight of every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. "My husband spent the last months of his life," she said, "not fighting for himself, but fighting for justice he wouldn't live to see. He gathered evidence at the cost of his own peace, hid it because he was afraid of what a man like Silas Boone might do if he learned too soon. He died protecting people he'd never even met, families who'd suffered the same fraud we suffered." Her eyes found Boone across the courtroom, and she did not look away. "Mr. Boone built his fortune on the backs of dying men and grieving widows, betting that grief would make us too weak, too distracted, too broken to notice what he'd done. He was wrong." Boone's lawyer attempted one final line of attack, suggesting that Eliza's relationship with Colt Bishop, a man she'd known mere weeks, cast doubt on her judgment, and perhaps her motives in pursuing this case so aggressively. "Mrs. Hartwell," the lawyer pressed, "isn't it true that you allowed a complete stranger to move onto your property almost immediately after your husband's death? A man with no verified history, no family in this territory, who conveniently appeared right as this supposed conspiracy came to light. Mr. Bishop took a bullet defending evidence that had nothing to do with him personally." Eliza replied, her voice cutting sharp through the courtroom's murmur. "If that's the behavior of a con artist, sir, then I'd say this territory needs a great many more of them." Laughter rippled through the gallery, and even the judge presiding over the case struggled to suppress a smile. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts of fraud. Guilty of falsifying legal documents. Guilty of conspiracy to defraud multiple families of their land and livelihood. The judge sentenced Boone to the maximum term allowed under territorial law and ordered full restitution to every family he'd wronged, including the return of land already seized from 2 families who'd lost everything in the years before Thomas ever discovered the pattern. Silas Boone's ranch, his cattle, his carefully built empire of fear and manipulation, all of it dismantled within a matter of months, sold off to satisfy the restitution owed to the families he'd destroyed. As the marshals led him from the courtroom, Boone turned back once his eyes finding Eliza's across the crowded room, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something genuinely broken in his expression. "You could have taken the settlement," he said, voice hollow. "Could have walked away with money enough to start fresh somewhere else." "I didn't want money, Mr. Boone. I wanted the truth. There's a difference, though. I don't expect a man like you ever understood it." Eliza stood in her own yard on the day the final papers arrived, confirming her land was fully and legally hers, free of any claim Boone or his estate might have pressed and found. She couldn't quite believe how light her chest felt after months of carrying fear like a stone lodged beneath her ribs. Patience grazed nearby, fully recovered. Now her coat sleek and glossy, her steps sure and strong, utterly transformed from the starving, broken creature nobody had wanted just months before. Colt worked beside the barn. His shoulder healed enough now that he'd insisted on helping with repairs, despite Eliza's protests that he ought to rest a while longer. "You keep working like that," she called over to him. "Folks are going to start wondering if you're planning on sticking around permanent." Colt set down his hammer, turning to look at her with an expression that made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with grief or fear anymore. "Would that trouble you?" he asked. "Me sticking around?" "Depends on your reasons for staying, Mr. Bishop." He crossed the yard slow, the same unhurried pace he'd carried the very first evening he'd ridden up her lane, and stopped close enough that Eliza had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. "My reasons," he said quietly, "have gotten a good deal more complicated than fixing fences and doctoring a sick cow, Mrs. Hartwell. I expect you've noticed that same as I have." "I might have noticed something along those lines, yes. Then I reckon I ought to just say it plain, seeing as you're a woman who's never had much patience for men dancing around the truth." His hand found hers, careful and warm. "I've buried my own share of grief, same as you. Watched everything I built get taken same as you nearly did. But somewhere between mending that fence and watching you refuse to quit when the whole world told you that you should, I stopped feeling like a man just passing through. Eliza felt tears rise again, different this time, warm instead of bitter. Thomas has only been gone a year, Colt. I know it. Wouldn't ask you to forget him, wouldn't want to, even if I could. Man built something worth remembering, worth honoring. His thumb traced gentle across her knuckles. But grief and love aren't enemies, Eliza. Reckon there's room enough in a person's heart for both if she's willing to make space. Behind them, Patience let out a low, contented sound, and Eliza found herself laughing through her tears, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Colt. Even she approves, Eliza said. Seems only fitting given she's the reason we ever crossed paths at all. Then I reckon we ought to thank her properly, Colt said, seeing as she's done more matchmaking than most folks manage in a lifetime. Part 5. Acknowledged absence of substantive content to process. Acknowledged absence of substantive content to process. Word of the trial spread faster than Eliza ever expected, and within weeks, the whole tenor of the county seemed to shift around her. Mabel Cross showed up at her gate one morning with a basket of preserves and an expression caught somewhere between shame and admiration. I said some hard things to you, Eliza, she admitted, not quite meeting her eyes. Called you a fool for spending your last dollar on a dying cow. You did. Well, Mabel shifted the basket in her arms, clearing her throat. Turns out the fool saw something the rest of us were too proud or too scared to notice. I'm sorry for that, truly. Apology accepted, Mabel. Lord knows we've all got things we wish we'd handled different. That drifter of yours, Mabel added, glancing toward the barn where Colt was working. His shoulder healed enough now that the sling had finally come off. Whole town's talking about how he took a bullet, rather than let Boone's men get their hands on that evidence. Might be the bravest thing anybody's done in this county in years. He'd tell you it wasn't bravery, just stubbornness. Sounds like the two of you were made for each other then. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't argue the point. You'll stay for coffee, she asked instead. I believe I will. Mabel settled onto the porch step with the ease of a woman who intended to make up for months of cold silence with considerably more warmth going forward. Tell me true, Eliza. Weren't you terrified that whole business with the marshal and the mill and all the rest? Terrified the whole time. Didn't stop me, but I won't pretend it wasn't there. Most brave things look that way from the inside, I expect. Fear and doing it anyway, all tangled together. Mabel accepted the cup Eliza offered, wrapping both hands around its warmth. I misjudged you badly, and I misjudged that cow worse. Whole town did. She taught me something, that cow. That broken and worthless aren't the same thing, no matter how loud folks insist they are. Yeah, the land Boone had seized from those other families, the ones Thomas had discovered and documented at such cost to himself, was returned in full through the territorial court's final ruling, and Eliza found herself present at more than one tearful reunion as widows and struggling families reclaimed homesteads they'd believed lost forever. One of them, Ruth Callahan, arrived at Eliza's homestead one afternoon, eyes red from crying, though her smile was genuine. They gave me my land back, Ruth said, voice trembling with disbelief. 15 acres gone for near 2 years, and now it's mine again. All because your husband cared enough to write it all down even while he was dying. He didn't want anybody else to suffer what he suspected was coming for me, Eliza said quietly. Wish he'd lived to see it through himself. Maybe he did in a way that mattered. Ruth reached out, squeezing her hand. Maybe some part of a person keeps fighting even after they're gone, if what they built is strong enough to outlast them. How will you manage it, Ruth? Working that land alone. Same as you, I expect. One day at a time and asking for help when pride finally lets me admit I need it. Ruth glanced toward the pasture where Patience grazed peaceful beside her calf. Might be I'll take a page from your book. There's an old plow horse at the livery in town, half blind, nobody wants him. Been thinking on him more than I probably should. Then go get him, Ruth. Sometimes the ones nobody wants turn out to be exactly what you needed most. Ruth laughed, wiping fresh tears from her cheeks. Never thought I'd hear myself taking advice about livestock from the woman half this county called a fool a year back. Funny how quick that word changes meaning once folks see the whole picture. Not everyone in the county had learned kindness so easily, however, and Eliza discovered that some wounds Boone had left behind ran deeper than a single trial could heal. One of his former ranch hands, a bitter man named Garrett, who'd lost his position when Boone's empire collapsed, showed up at her fence line one evening, reeking of whiskey and resentment. "You did this," he slurred, gripping the fence rail hard enough that his knuckles went white. "Ruined a good man's life over some dying cow and a pile of old papers." Colt was there before Eliza could even respond, stepping between her and the fence with quiet, immovable authority. "That's enough," Colt said, voice low but carrying unmistakable warning. "You've got no business here, and you're in no state to be making threats." "Wasn't threatening nobody. Just stating facts." Garrett's eyes were unfocused, but the anger in them was real enough. "Boone gave men like me steady work. Now the whole ranch is broken up, sold off piece by piece, and it's her fault. Boone broke families apart for years to build that ranch," Eliza said, stepping up beside Colt despite his warning glance. "If you worked for a man who did that and never once questioned where his fortune came from, that's a reckoning you need to make with yourself, not with me." "Easy for you to say. You've got your land back, your fancy drifter. What have I got? A choice." Eliza said softer now, something almost like sympathy creeping into her voice despite the man's hostility. "Same choice every one of us has every single morning. Keep drinking, keep blaming, keep letting a dead man's greed decide the shape of your whole life, or find something worth building that doesn't depend on a man like Boone signing your wages." Garrett's jaw worked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Eliza's steady gaze and the quiet strength she'd built over the past year seemed to deflate whatever fight he'd ridden over with. "This ain't over," he muttered instead, though the words carried more defeat than menace now. "It is for tonight," Colt said firmly. "Go home, sleep it off, and think hard about whether you want to be the kind of man who blames a widow for another man's crimes." Garrett rode off into the darkness, and Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "There'll be others like him," she said quietly. "Boone had a lot of people depending on him, even if his money was built on cruelty." "Maybe so, but you're not facing any of them alone anymore." Colt's hand found hers in the darkness, steady and certain. "Not ever again if I've got any say in the matter." "You really mean to stay then? Truly?" "Already told you my reasons, Eliza. Wasn't speaking idle words that day by the barn." Summer stretched long and golden across the homestead in the months that followed, and Eliza watched her land transform in ways she'd never dared imagine possible during those early weeks of grief and desperation. Patience, fully recovered, gave birth to a healthy calf that spring proof of Colt's early diagnosis finally realized, and word spread through the county about the widow who'd rescued a dying cow that everyone else had written off as worthless. Other struggling families began arriving at her gate, some seeking advice, others simply curious about the animal that had somehow become a symbol of second chances across the whole territory. A young couple from 3 counties over rode in one afternoon, having heard the story secondhand through a traveling preacher, hoping Eliza might look at a starving mule they'd taken in against everyone's advice. "Folks are calling it foolish," the young wife admitted, wringing her hands nervous. "Same as they called you foolish from what we heard." "Foolish and patient look a whole lot alike from the outside," Eliza told her. "Difference only shows up later once the patience has time to work." She found herself almost without meaning to, building something larger than she'd ever intended, a small network of families helping each other through hard seasons, sharing knowledge about caring for sick or neglected livestock, refusing to let any creature or any person be discarded simply because the world had decided too quickly they weren't worth the effort. "Never thought I'd see the day," Judge Carter remarked, visiting one afternoon to check on how the restitution proceedings had settled for the various families involved. A dying cow at the center of the biggest fraud case this territory's seen in a decade, and now half the county riding out to your gate for advice on livestock and life both. She wasn't dying, Judge. She was just waiting for somebody to look past what everyone assumed about her. Eliza watched Patience nose gently at her calf patient, and unhurried, and felt the truth of her own words settle deep. Same as most of us, I expect, when life's knocked us down hard enough that folks stop bothering to see what's still worth saving. The judge smiled, something warm and genuine in his tired eyes. Your husband would be proud of what you've built here, Mrs. Hartwell. Not just the justice you brought to light, but everything that's grown up around it since. I like to think so. And Mr. Bishop, I understand congratulations might soon be in order if the rumors circulating through town carry any truth to them. Eliza felt her cheeks warm, glancing toward the barn, where Colt was working strong and steady, the same quiet honesty in his every movement that had first convinced her to trust a stranger's offer of help all those months ago. Rumors have a way of getting ahead of themselves, Judge. Do they? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a woman who's finally found somebody worth building a future alongside. That evening, as the sun sank low and gold across the pasture, painting long shadows behind the barn, where Patience grazed peaceful with her calf close beside her, Colt found Eliza sitting on the porch steps, the weight of the past year visible in the quiet stillness of her posture. "Judge Carter say something to trouble you?" he asked, settling down beside her. No, quite the opposite, actually. She turned to look at him, something soft and certain in her expression that hadn't been there in the earliest days of their acquaintance. He asked about rumors circulating through town, about us. Colt's mouth curved into a slow smile. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him rumors have a way of getting ahead of themselves." "Do they?" He reached into his coat pocket, and Eliza's breath caught when she saw what he withdrew, a simple band of gold, clearly worn, but carefully polished, clearly meant with intention, rather than impulse. "Because I've been carrying this around for near a month now, waiting for the right moment, and I'm getting mighty tired of waiting." "Colt, I know Thomas built this place with you. Know his memories stitched into every board of that barn, every fence post we've mended together. I'm not asking you to forget any of that, Eliza. Wouldn't want to, even if I could." His hand found hers steady, despite the vulnerability plain in his eyes. "I'm just asking if there's room enough in this life you're building for one more person who intends to stand beside you through whatever comes next. Good years and hard ones both." Tears rose warm in Eliza's eyes, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they carried nothing but joy. "Thomas would have liked you, I think. Would have respected a man willing to take a bullet for a truth that wasn't even his own fight to begin with." That means yes, Colt Bishop. Wholeheartedly, completely yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, despite his usual steady composure, and somewhere behind them, Patience let out a low, contented sound, as though she understood perfectly well what her own small act of walking toward a stranger months before had ultimately set into motion. "She approves," Eliza said, laughing through her tears. "Reckon she's earned the right to an opinion given everything her walking toward that well set into motion." Yeah. News of the engagement spread through the county faster than the trial verdict had, and this time the whispers that followed Eliza carried nothing but warmth. Even Garrett sobered up and humbled in the weeks since his drunken confrontation at her fence, sent word through a neighbor that he wished her well, along with an awkward offer to help repair her barn roof as some manner of apology. She accepted because Colt reminded her gently that grace given freely tended to multiply in ways punishment never could. They married that autumn beneath the same cottonwood trees, where Thomas had once proposed to Eliza, years before, a detail she'd shared with Colt, not out of sorrow, but out of a desire to honor every thread of the life that had led her to this new one. The whole county turned out. It seemed faces that had once whispered "fool" behind cupped hands, now smiling warm and genuine, as Eliza walked down a simple aisle of scattered wildflowers toward the man who'd refused to let her face injustice alone. Ruth Callahan was there, her half-blind plow horse, thriving under her care, standing proud despite his clouded eyes. Daniel Whitfield attended too, no longer trembling with fear, but standing tall, having taken a position with the Territorial Land Office, overseeing exactly the kind of loan practices that had once nearly destroyed him. Judge Carter gave a toast that left half the gathering in tears, speaking of Thomas's quiet courage and the way justice, however delayed, always eventually found its way home to those patient enough to wait for it. Even Mabel Cross cried openly through the ceremony, muttering something about stubborn women and second chances that made Eliza laugh through her own happy tears. Patience stood near the fence line throughout the entire ceremony, calf close beside her, watching with the same patient knowing eyes she'd carried since that very first morning at the auction yard, when everyone else had already decided her life wasn't worth the price of a bullet. "Never seen a cow attend a wedding before," Colt murmured to Eliza as they exchanged vows, drawing quiet laughter from those close enough to hear. "She's earned her place here more than most," Eliza whispered back. "Wouldn't be standing here without her." Years later, when travelers passed through that stretch of Wyoming territory, they'd often hear the story from locals eager to share it. The tale of a grieving widow who spent her last dollar on a dying cow. Nobody wanted only to uncover a fraud that had haunted half the county's families for years, and to find in the process a love and a justice that neither she nor anyone else could have predicted that dusty morning at the auction pens. The homestead grew steadily across those years, not into some vast empire built on other people's suffering the way Boone's ranch had been, but into something quieter and sturdier, a place where struggling families knew they could always find honest help, and an animal too broken for anyone else's patience could always find a second chance. Eliza never tired of telling the story herself, especially to the children, who eventually filled the homestead with laughter, hers and Colt's both growing up alongside Patience's line of gentle, sturdy cattle that became known throughout the territory for their remarkable health and temperament. "Why'd you buy her, Mama?" her eldest daughter asked once, years later, watching Patience graze peaceful in the golden light of another Wyoming summer gray, now around the muzzle, but still moving with quiet dignity. "Everybody said she was worthless." Eliza knelt down beside her daughter, taking her small hand and guiding it gentle toward the old cow's neck, watching Patience lean into the touch with the same quiet trust she'd shown from that very first evening in the barn. "Because worthless is just a word folks use when they haven't taken the time to truly look," Eliza said softly. "Your father Thomas taught me that in his own quiet way before he ever said a single word to me directly. And your Papa Colt taught me that some people are worth trusting even when the whole world tells you strangers can't be believed. Sometimes the things everybody else has given up on turn out to be exactly the thing that saves us." Her daughter considered that with the serious solemnity only children manage, then smiled and pressed her small palm flatter against Patience's warm side. "I'm glad you didn't give up on her." "So am I, sweetheart." Eliza looked up to find Colt watching them both from across the yard, the same steady warmth in his eyes that had first drawn her to trust him on a night when trust felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. "So am I." Patience lived to a remarkable age for a cow that everyone had once sworn wouldn't survive the week, and when she finally passed peaceful in her sleep one quiet autumn morning, half the county turned out for what Mabel Cross only half-jokingly called the finest funeral a cow had ever received in the history of the territory. Eliza buried her beneath the same cottonwood trees where she'd married Colt, close enough to the spot where the buried saddlebag had first surfaced the truth that changed everything. "Feels right," Colt said, standing beside her at the fresh grave, his arm steady around her shoulders, burying her close to where the whole thing started. "She didn't just start at Colt. She led us there. Every step of it, from that well to that creek bed, to standing witness at our wedding. She knew things we didn't write from that very first morning. Maybe animals see clearer than people sometimes, not distracted by pride or fear the way we are. Maybe so." Eliza pressed her hand flat against the disturbed earth, the same gesture she'd once used to comfort a starving, broken creature nobody else wanted. "Thank you," she whispered to the cow, to Thomas, to whatever quiet force had guided a dying animal to walk toward her rather than away that dusty morning at the auction yard. "For choosing me first." The finest ranch in that stretch of Wyoming territory never grew from greed or fear the way Silas Boone's empire once had. It grew instead from patience, from the simple, stubborn refusal to believe that anything or anyone broken beyond repair was truly beyond saving. And long after Eliza Hartwell's own children had grown and built homesteads of their own across that same golden country, The story remained told and retold at firesides and kitchen tables throughout the territory. A lasting truth carved deep into the land itself. Some of the greatest fortunes in this world are never measured in cattle or land or gold. The truest wealth belongs to those patient enough to see worth where everyone else has already stopped looking and brave enough to reach out anyway. That more than any courtroom verdict or restored deed remained the truest thing Eliza Hartwell ever learned in her long and remarkable life. And it is a truth that endures still as certain and unshakable as the Wyoming sun rising golden over land once written off as worthless, now flourishing beyond anyone's wildest expectation.